Hello and welcome to Neighborhood Money Podcast, a video podcast here to help you build a life you deserve. Drew, episode 48, and today we're going to try something a little bit different. Typically for these episodes, we have a fairly structured, or at least an outline of what the episode's going to be. Obviously, we've brought some interviews with people. We come definitely more prepared for those. But today, Drew and I were just brainstorming on some ideas, and behind the scenes, Drew and I have some pretty awesome conversations around money, the economy, and all that stuff. And we're like, hey, why don't we just shoot the shit for one episode, see how it goes, and see if we can find something out of that type of conversation. So that's exactly what we're going to bring to you guys today. Is Drew and I are just going to talk about the current state of inflation in the economy. We were talking a little bit before, Drew, about it, and I think it's going to be a pretty interesting episode. If not, it's going to be pretty fun for us too. But hopefully we can provide some value to the listener, whether that's informational, educational, or hopefully both.
It's funny having a podcast and going with this style for this episode. I just look back at most of our other podcasts. Like you said, we have some type of an outline. We come a little bit more prepared, and we're thinking, oh, maybe this won't be as long of an episode. And then next thing you know, an hour and a half has passed.
Right,
but then we end these podcasts and we talk sometimes for 2 or 3 hours after, and it just kind of stems off of one thing or the other. So I'm kind of excited to see where this type of episode can go. I know there's like a little bit of a structure around just saying maybe it starts with inflation or the current state of the economy, but I'm pretty excited because I know when we get done with the podcast and we talk, I get pretty energized after we end up talking.
So today is going to be all about inflation. But first, I got to do the humble plug for the podcast. So we ask you guys if you guys get value from this podcast, or if you enjoy your time with us. We know we enjoy our time with you guys. If you can do a couple of things for us, that would be awesome. One is, if you're listening to the audio version, please consider giving us a 5-star review out on Apple Podcasts and write a review telling us what you love about this podcast. That helps an awful lot when people, search the Apple Podcast and they see us. They can read some of those reviews and also know that they might like it. If you are watching over on YouTube, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. We are almost 100 YouTube subscribers, Drew. I'm pretty fired up about that, to get to the 3 digits. It'll be a big milestone for us. But please go out there and subscribe if you haven't already. Like this video if you found value, and also drop us a comment. Let us know future episodes that you guys are interested, what you guys think about the current state of inflation. Are you guys feeling the pain, or just drop by and say hi. It doesn't really matter. All of that stuff, any type of interaction with us helps us an awful lot.
I just was thinking about kind of a joke of bringing that up about people watching us on YouTube. And I just always think of that one joke. Well, yeah, you guys just have the face for radio. So like the audio ones don't get to see us, but I think that's always a funny joke. But I think I could start out. Actually, go ahead. What were you trying to say there?
No, go for it, man. I was going to try to make some witty comment, but the time has passed.
The time's passed. I just jumped right over it. But I think the thing that I was going to start out this episode with is I was reading an article earlier today, and it was by this Sarah O'Brien on CNBC, and she's talking about these new car prices that are going on right now. And the article was the cost to finance a new car hits a record $656 per month. And this is just like what people are paying on a monthly basis for their car, which seems extremely high. And I think what was even more interesting about this article is the new car prices, year over year price changes on a percentage basis. Was new cars were, let me see here, is like 16, or new car prices are up 12.6% from a year ago, and used car prices are up 16.1%. And just last month, those were like closer to the 30%. So when I look at that, from last year to this year, this might have been about the time a year ago when the prices started getting jacked up even more. And even though it seems like a smaller percentage year over year, these prices are still high and they're not going down anytime soon.
Yeah, I think, at the fundamental of just the economy that we live in, used cars prices is a really good example. It's when you're in a high inflationary time, 5, 8, 10, hyperinflation, when you get beyond that, that's only a year over year look. Once you get to that year where you're started measuring on high inflation, the Fed tries to return us to like to 2-3%, but you still have that high inflationary period of for us, it's almost 9%. And so it's not like prices are coming back down. It's more so that prices are, for the most part, here to stay. And you might get some relief on like used car prices. You might get some relief on energy or things like that, but it's really because we live in an inflationary economy. So we have to have inflation in order for our economy to grow, at least in the current state of it. And I don't think people realize that is, when you have a high inflationary environment, it's not just while you're in that period, it's beyond that is where you're going to continue to feel the pain until you have wage growth really catch up with that. And, hopefully people are starting to see some wage growth, or hopefully will here in the next year, coming around that new year time frame. For some people have other opportunities to get pay raises. And so that's where you might start feeling some relief. But unfortunately, because we're in that inflationary economy and we're in high inflation right now, it's just going to be a really sucky time for a lack of a better word, for the foreseeable future.
Well, I'm glad you brought up wages, because that is something that's been on my mind during these high inflationary times. Is so in this May 2022 inflation number came out, and 8.6%. And something that I've been hearing, whether it be on the internet or in person and from employers, like, how are you dealing with this? How are you incentivizing your employees, or are you trying to wait out the storm? And sometimes I end up hearing of, these are just kind of unprecedented times. This type of inflation isn't going to continue year after year. So they almost kind of are sitting on the sideline of saying, well, we only have like our 2 or 3% inflationary increases, and we'll just stick with that, because hopefully in the coming years it's still going to be 2 or 3%. But even though it might be a crazy time, like we're saying, these costs aren't going back down. It's not going to be deflationary. So even though your inflation percentage may be at a smaller or bigger amount now and smaller amount in the future, these costs of goods and your cost of living is continuing to increase. So you are already behind the eight ball if you don't get that inflationary increase during the year of these unprecedented times. And then it begs the question of, being on the employer side, what do you do to pay for these wages? Are you increasing your cost or your prices for your services and goods? Are you trying to find ways to cut costs somewhere else? Are you trying to restructure your company so that you can pay your employees what you need to? So it's really, the wage part really intrigues me, because on the employee side, you don't want to be able to lose money with inflation. And on the employer side, it's kind of doesn't happen too often. This is kind of like unprecedented. And then if you are going to give these wage increases, how are you going to bring in that extra money to be able to afford that?
Yeah, let's be honest. It's all margins, right? Or how much companies are going to make in profit. And if they're increasing wages, they're going to increase prices, and they're going to put that on the end consumer, which is then in turn going to increase inflation, which then in turn could potentially increase wages. And they call that the wage spiral, the wage death spiral, whatever it's called. And that's how you get really into a lot of trouble when it comes to inflation. And that's very scary, right? Because if you keep playing that game, you could be looking at this type of inflation for a long time. And I actually was just listening to a podcast this morning, and it's a Bitcoin podcast, so it's kind of anti government money, it's anti inflationary economies. But the guy, he was saying that this inflationary period could be for the next decade. Like, we could be looking at a decade worth of higher inflation, above the 2 to 3% Fed target that they have. And Drew, that's bad. Like, if you're thinking like a period of 10 years sitting between 5 and 10%, that's gonna be pretty harmful, specifically if wages don't continue to keep up with inflation. And so, Drew, maybe we should just like step back a little bit and just talk about like how do we even get to this point of inflation? Most people probably, when they think about inflation, they think of it as like a very healthy increase in price, a healthy increase in wage. But right now, obviously, we're sitting at 8.6, 8.7%. That's probably not real inflation. Real inflation is probably in like the 10 to 15%. Uh, so how do we actually get to this period of high inflation in an economy that, generally speaking, was doing pretty okay? Obviously, we had COVID, but was a pretty strong economy.
It's kind of funny that inflation is constantly touted, or is that the right word? But it's always perceived as good for the economy. It's strong for the economy. It means your economy's growing. And like the more I look at inflation, and maybe it's the crypto in me, or the crypto knowledge that I've got from the decentralized people, but I just feel as if inflation isn't as good as they say it is. I think it's kind of a big lie that they just tell us, because on whether it's the government books that constantly get more tax revenue, they're not really worried about the value of the dollar as much. And it's kind of the individual and the taxpayer that, in my opinion, tends to really struggle with inflation. And inflation now just goes even more crazy when we've been in times of such low interest rates that people that normally wouldn't be able to afford or buy these bigger ticket items are now buying these because they can afford them on a month to month basis. And it's driving up demand and lowering the supply for these. So these prices increase. And then these people that are making the prices are then saying, well, these people are able to afford it and they're buying it, so might as well increase our margins and our price a little bit more. And then that just increases inflation even more. And it's not really wage driven, it's now leveraged inflation, in my opinion.
If we look at how an economy like the US gets to a point of high inflation, there's a couple of things that you can easily point at. One, the fact that our economy is based off of the US dollar, right? And the US dollar is not backed by any single thing besides our army, our military, right? And so maybe I'll be a little too nerd out here, but that's fine. So it used to be pegged on the gold. We used to have a gold standard across the globe where every US dollar represented a certain weight of gold. And what that meant is that you could only have as much US dollars as the US had in gold. And so that made sure that the government couldn't just print money if they wanted to. Well, we definitely went off that standard in like the 70s or something like that. And what that ultimately gave the government the power to just make money out of thin air whenever they want. And this has been happening for like the last decade or two, where the government has been continuing to push money into the economy. And I think that's a really important thing to understand, is because when the government, and this is getting probably way too into the weeds, but when the government prints more money, what that means is ultimately it means that the money you have is worth less. And so they actually are taking away your savings when they print money. They're not, taking away the ones and zeros from your bank account, but rather they're putting more money into the economy, which makes the money you have worth less. And it's touted, like you said, as a very healthy way to grow an economy, and arguably so, depending on, what type of economic theories you believe in. That's specifically Keynesian or Keynes, if you will. And so over the last, decade or so, we've had money pumped into the economy, and then really it hit hard in 2008 and 2009, and then specifically during COVID in 2020 and 2021, where the government, one, added stimulus checks, but the biggest one, Drew, is they did quantitative easing, which essentially is they will buy bonds from people or from companies, and then that just puts money out into the economy. And actually, Drew, during COVID, the government went from $4 trillion on their balance sheet or on their books to almost $9 trillion. And so they over doubled the amount of money that's in the economy. And so what does that all mean, right? Like, I'm just talking a lot of jargon, probably to some people that aren't as interested in finance and economics as us, but hopefully, I mean, maybe they're listening to this podcast. But what does that ultimately mean? It means that there's a lot of cash in the economy, which means that your money that you own is worth less. And that's why prices increase. And that's why you see used cars increase. And then you start getting into, on top of that, the supply chain issues that we've seen. And all of this is just like the perfect storm to have demand just be at an all-time high and supply be low. And that is where, you start seeing inflation, and that, not only are prices high, but then you start seeing your people's wealth get removed because of basically the free printing press that the government has.
One of the phrases that I've heard that kind of changed a mindset of inflation is, during your years or decades of potentially owning a house and it appreciates in value, the phrase was, your house isn't worth more, your dollar is just worth less. And I find that like really interesting, because you feel like, my house is worth so much more, look at this great investment I had. But by the time that appreciates the value that you're able to say that, your cost of living and your value of your dollar has actually decreased so much that your buying power to get that type of a house again would be very difficult. So I thought that was kind of like an interesting mindset change when I heard that phrase. And
Drew, I like the house example because it's people look at it as an investment from time to time, and I definitely don't think you should, but it's more of like a savings account. It will generally grow 2 to 3% per year with inflation, and by the time you sell it, plus all of the fees, you're going to be out money and buy, in real terms, in purchasing power. But I think it's really important to know that, because inflation does just eat away at your wealth.
It for surely does. And when just to go back a little bit here, when you were talking about this perfect storm for this inflationary time, and I mean, it's so true with all these supply shortages that we have right now. And, there's, I don't think, one exact root cause, but we have right now product that's being made overseas so much. So to get that product over to the US, depending on regulations on how these restrictions with COVID have been, it's extremely hard. And then once they get to our port, then you have to worry about actually checking in all this product, and you have to have workers for that. So if you don't have workers, that's going to take extra long. And then now these things are backed up so much that you need truckers to go. But now we're having higher gas prices. We have not enough truckers because it's been like it's been more and more difficult to get a, a class A driver's license. And so now you have your truckers that have to charge more because of gas, and because they have short people, they have to work maybe potentially more hours. And then once that happens, then they have to get to where they need to go. And it's just such a supply shock that we've had, that now we've had these perfect storm of increased wages, labor shortages, product shortages, high demand, stimulus checks to have more money printed, as and I just don't know of a more perfect storm for inflation than what we've had right now. And it doesn't really seem like there's some type of light at the end of the tunnel for this thing to be managed any time within the next couple years. This year for sure. And it's funny that in our first inflation video, I don't know if that was 40 episodes ago or 30 episodes ago, but we used the word transitory because that was the hot point. And as we said, is transitory is very arbitrary, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be in a month. There's no specific date. It could end up being a year, could be 5 years, and they can say it's transitory because it's so general and broad.
Well, they walked that back. The Fed came out and said, "Hey, we got it wrong. Like, we got this wrong. Like, that's on us." But maybe that's a good place to go, Drew. Let's talk about like how do we go from here, right? Because people are probably thinking like probably blaming anyone under the moon. You know, an easy target's a president, Congress, Senate, whatever it is. But I think it's important to note that the Federal Reserve is responsible, has a mandate for inflation. Now, you can argue that the Fed has political motivations or at least influences. We won't go there, right? We won't go there. We've talked about how we've tried to keep this pretty non-political podcast, but the Fed has a mandate to ultimately control inflation, and they can do that in a couple of ways, right? They can, one, raise interest rates. They can raise the Fed funds rate, which in turn raises interest rates on mortgages, on car loans, credit cards, things like that, which encourages people to stop spending, which then cools the economy, bringing down inflation. So that's one way. The next is quantitative tightening. Quantitative tightening, I'll say that a little slower. But that's basically they are just taking money out of the economy. So it's the reverse of what I said earlier with quantitative easing. They're actually just selling bonds and taking money out of the economy. So they can do that in two ways. And typically they would do that in an inflationary period. You know, if inflation's running a little hotter than normal, they would do one or both of those actions to, cool the economy. Unfortunately, Drew, right now we are in my opinion, a recession. I'm probably going to be wrong on that, but there's a really good chance we are in one. And the way that the Fed can manage a recession is kind of opposite to how they can manage inflation. So I said to manage inflation, they raise interest rates. Well, in a recession, you lower interest rates to encourage spending. And so I think, Drew, and it's the opposite for quantitative tightening and easing, like I said, but we're going, or if not in a recession, the Fed is going to have their hands tied. Are they going to pick a recession, which leads to high unemployment? Or are they going to choose to battle inflation and get that down, but ultimately push us into a recession or a deeper recession? So I think just looking at that, the Fed, who is responsible for this, is in a really tough place. And unfortunately for us, that means that, more than likely they're going to try to avoid a recession or a deep recession at all costs. And so inflation is probably going to get pushed higher, if not stay the same. I'm not going to say where it is because I have no idea, but that's kind of where we're at right now. And that's kind of scary to me if I'm going to be totally honest.
To be a little doomsday here and a little scary on my side as well is if this continues and these rates continue to increase and we have people that potentially are saying these costs of living is getting too expensive, I can't afford to have this house I just bought or this new vehicle I just bought, and they're not able to sell it because nobody wants to buy it on these new interest rates, and they start defaulting on them. A lot of the levers that the Fed can pull have been pulled during 2020 and 21 when they try to get out of the COVID stock market price drop or economy drop. And we've already printed money, so that's gone crazy. We're having extremely high inflation. They've dropped the rates to pretty much zero for a while there. Now they're increasing them again because they're seeing that having these low interest rates have pushed inflation even more. So if there was any type of a doomsday scenario or something similar to 2008, to get out of that would be extremely, extremely difficult because everything that we used to fight 2008, we've pretty much already used to fight COVID back in March 2020. And they've seen that those levers didn't necessarily work the way they hoped. And if that were to happen, inflation would go crazy. These rates, they wouldn't know. I don't know what you do with the rates. Would you drop them down and try to produce spending more, but you couldn't do that. You couldn't be printing anymore because what they say almost was it like 30 or 40% of our money supply was printed in the last year. So you can't really be printing a whole lot more. So in a little doomsday way,
Why not? Why can't they?
yeah,
I mean, they definitely could, right? They've done it. I mean, it sucks, don't get me wrong, but why couldn't they?
yeah, that's
You know, they have all the power to, and maybe that's where I bring it into like just the state of or the economy we're in, right? The inflationary economy is one of which, when you're not backed by gold, or you know,
mhm.
you just have this free printing press, they can do whatever they want, and they're going to do what's ever convenient
Yeah.
for the given time, whether it's trying to get us out of recession or, unfortunately, for like political power or might.
Yeah, if there's people listening to this podcast that maybe don't believe in crypto by any means, I would I would recommend just listening to some of their thoughts and just seeing another side of the coin. And even if you don't want to invest in crypto, just to hear what they have to say about how money works and the economy and everything else around that, I would definitely recommend doing that because I think it will open your eyes to a whole lot more of potentially what can happen and what's potentially going to happen or could happen or whatever it may be. So that would be one thing I would say.
Well, I mean, if we bring that back to the economy, right? How, or inflation specifically, because we're in an inflationary economy and interest rates have been so low, we have a huge amount of debt in the system. People might be thinking like consumer debt, but the real debt is in corporate world. And you know, there's a ton of debt. And so inflation rising high, if the Fed has to increase rates, there's a point in time where if the Fed raises rates high enough to battle inflation, the government won't be able to pay their debts. You might start seeing larger defaults, and that kind of just tumbles the entire system, which that's doomsday for sure. But the reason I bring that up is because, you know, specifically Bitcoiners, that's kind of the system that Bitcoin's trying to build. They're trying to build the opposite of what the current fiat economy we're in. And fiat just means US dollars or, you know, Canadian dollars, whatever it is. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm looking at this screen because Drew's over here. Usually I look at the camera, but sorry about that anyways. But yeah, so the whole idea of Bitcoin specifically is that it's a deflationary currency, and you don't get these huge issues of high inflation. You don't get these huge debt bubbles. And it's the opposite. Like, no one controls the printing press. No one can add more currency and debase the money. Debasing just means adding more money to make it worth less. But no one can do it. And right now, in the economy we live in, the government can just print money, and that debases it, and that makes it worth less. And so I totally agree, Drew. You know, I read the Bitcoin Standard, and just reading that like blew my mind around how I thought about money. And it does open your eyes to how some of these things kind of play out, and you can kind of see that they could be avoided, but the economy that we're in, it's not going to be, because it is inflationary. And unfortunately, where we're at with the high inflation, in a recession potentially, you know, I think it's going to get pretty nasty here. And it's going to be really interesting to see if out of that comes more people hopping on cryptocurrencies, or specifically Bitcoin, because like, hey, the current system sucks. You know, if you're one that's working, you know, 3 jobs just to get by, and you're not making a whole lot, like, those people are getting hurt the most because they can't save anything, and the savings they do have is going away because of inflation. And I think that coming out of this current environment, people might be like, hey, there's got to be something better out there. You know, the Bitcoiners are getting louder, other cryptocurrencies are as well. But it'll be interesting to see, you know, how the economy reacts, and, you know, what comes of it, because I think, you know, we're going into a pretty buy your time. Every podcast and stuff I listen to, it's pretty doomsday-ish. I'm trying to avoid that. I know I'm being a little pessimistic, but I think you kind of have to be in this current environment, specifically if you're trying to explain what's going on. And hopefully that's coming across here. But I totally agree. I would read the Bitcoin Standard. I'll drop it in the description if you guys want to check it out. It's a hefty read for sure, but I think you'll get an awful lot from it if you decide to dive in.
Yeah, when I was talking about it before, I couldn't think of the word I wanted to say. I kept saying recommend, but I wanted to say I challenge you. And that's why I was kind of stumbling, because in my mind I was like, what is the word I'm thinking of? I challenge you to just hear the side of the crypto. You don't have to invest in it, but that was the word I was trying to look for. So it sounded like I was stumbling over my thoughts, is because I kept trying to think of the word I wanted to say. But anyways, to say two things. So what you were just saying there, one, talking about gold, and two, talking about people getting hurt the most. I'm going to say this in front here, just so if I forget halfway through the one, you can remind me. First, on the gold side, when you're on a gold standard, there isn't necessarily money printing or gold printing, but there are gold. It can still be slightly inflationary because it's constantly being mined and then put in. So
it is inflationary. I think it's like, I'm not going to get these stats wrong, but I think it's like 1 to 3% of the gold is added to the economy. So, I'll let you start off again, Drew, but if you think about how gold is, like all the gold that's ever been mined exists in the world right now, in the economy, is whatever. And so as you add more gold in, even if you mine a crap ton of gold, as much gold as you possibly can, it's still going to be such a small subset of the current gold that exists, out of the ground. So it's going to be, that I want to say it's like 2-ish% inflation for gold.
I wonder if that is where these Fed's inflationary numbers came from, was gold. And maybe before, when we're told inflation is good, it was because of gold. And maybe that was if you put more gold into the economy, that means it can be used for more, or it could be spent more, and more, it could be in more people's hands. And maybe they thought of it that way, but then once you go off, it just kind of obsolete. So, but that was my thought on gold, is just gold is inflationary as well, but you have to go out and physically mine it and try to find it. You can't just press a button and everything's increased big time.
Drew, let me hop in there, because I think this one's interesting too. So the difference between hard money and soft money. Gold is a very hard money, meaning that it's hard to produce more of it. Whereas like the US dollar is a very soft, I shouldn't say very soft, because it's not in theory. Granted, my internal belief is that it is.
That's all we need to hear.
The US dollars can be printed out of thin air, and it is every single day. So that's a soft money. And so the way history has played out is that hard monies win out. And an example of that is, there is I forget exactly where in Africa, but there was a tribe or community that used seashells for money because they were very valuable, because they weren't where they were located. Then European settlers came in and they're like, oh, these seashells, like, we know where those are. And so they would bring that in, and they could buy anything they wanted from the tribe, the community, and the tribe community thought they were getting richer, but really they were just getting debased. And so those seashells were soft money, whereas the European settlers were using, I think in the example, the story is gold was their standard. So they had a very hard money. And the point of that is that when you introduce two types of monies, the hard money is going to win out. And that, so if you start looking at, okay, well, what's hard money right now? You can look towards Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is a finite amount of money that will ever exist, amount of coins that will ever exist. It's deflationary in nature. And so no one can control it. No one can put more out into the economy. So that makes it a very hard money. And there's more to it, but I think that's very important to understand. It's like, hey, there's soft monies and there's hard monies, and the hard monies, in historically speaking, have always won out.
It's interesting with hard money too, when you think about what it takes to actually get it. And our whole economy is around production and creating and making sure your next day can be better than your last, or you can help or solve a solution. But with hard money too, you to mine it, it takes goods and services to be able to get products there. To it, you have to employ people to do it. You have to bring certain things to the site. You have to be able to transport it. And with hard money, there's also an element that it also produces towards the actual economy, whereas a soft money can be something as the printing press and just pressing a button, and it doesn't really produce or create anything else for the economy on top of its just inherent value that we give it. So I think that's kind of interesting to think about a hard money and a soft money as well.
Yeah, it's soft money will reduce your savings and your wealth, where hard money will help you save and push your value that you have today into the future to be able to live off that down the road. But Drew, you said you had another thing you were going to talk about, those people that get hurt the
Yeah,
most.
and that was I might have said it on another podcast, or maybe it was just our conversations, but when people were talking about the stimulus checks coming out and helping the people that needed them the most, and it was such a short period of time where they were able to get past a couple months of bills, and that helped them and gave them some breathing room, and it felt nice. I mean, the people that had it were probably very, very thankful for it. But it's interesting how it just worked pretty much complete opposite for them, where in those couple months they gave them some breathing room, but now after those couple months have been gone, everything else has gotten so much more expensive and so much more hard, and those things will be permanent. Those stimulus checks were a temporary band-aid fix, and so the people that you didn't want the stimulus checks to work for, or what people say of like, we don't want to give stimulus checks to the rich because the rich have enough money, they actually gave the rich more money than they could have asked for, because they are the ones holding assets that are appreciating with these inflation rates. So it might be paper money, but it's still money on their books that they're actually making much more money off this printing, and it's hurting the people that need it the most. And it's ironic that that's how the stimulus checks ended up working out.
And I think it's important to point out that, not just the stimulus checks, like that has been part of why we are where we are, but just the inflationary economy that we live in, and the fact that government can, both sides of the aisle do this for sure. But the fact that government can just print money is ultimately, taking your savings, and all what money actually is just the value you provide to society. It's reducing your value. And so it's a really tricky situation we're in. I know we're kind of all over the board right now, but looking forward, it is the fact that inflation is high. We are in a recession. It's going to be some pretty tough times here to come. So I think if there's any word of advice that I would provide right now is, you got to start just like looking at your budget. You got to start saying, okay, well, what can I reduce? What are the must-haves? What, can I start stacking some cash, even though if we are in an inflationary environment, so that's going to get reduced over time. But the fact that we're on the path for a recession and inflation, I think it's a good time to play defense right now if you can, and put yourself in a good position to weather a storm. Obviously, if it gets too bad, if history repeats, government will step in and hopefully help out those people that need it. But I think right now is a really good time to start stacking some cash, start preparing for a recession, but also work your plan if you can. I know me specifically, I'm continuing to invest in all the different assets that I do, specifically the SP 500. It's been down like 15-20% this year. I continue to invest into Bitcoin. That's down like over 50%. So I say strong with those ideals, but I'm also being more aware of where I'm spending my money, my discretionary money. and making sure I can cut back where I need to if need be.
Yeah, I mean, if I could bring something out of this podcast to the listeners, it would be really still do some of your own research. What you hear on TV getting pushed day after day, they tend to have the same talking points, and it gets in your mind and you actually start believing it. So I would say really do your own research and think about what they're actually telling you, what these numbers actually are. And the example I'm going to use is with this CPI. I know in the past I am skeptical of the CPI, but that's what they push and that's what numbers you're going to end up seeing. So that's why I'm bringing the CPI into this. With these numbers, you're going to see in the next couple months, they're going to say these percentage rates, these inflation rates year over year have been declining, and we're fixing the problem right now. And it's going to seem a little bit more bright. And this could probably be going into certain elections if it needs to be. But when I see,
For sure, into certain
and,
elections, Drew.
and they'll,
Let's not beat around the bush,
yeah,
man.
but they will use these numbers and the reason I'm saying is so it will look like these numbers are decreasing, but they're year over year. So if it was extremely high last year and it's still instead of 30%, it's 16%, that cost has not decreased for you year over year. It has increased and it's going to continue to increase. So when this inflation number tends to be more in control, quote unquote, the prices are still the same and still increasing. You're not going to have that decrease. So when you might feel happy about it being finally 2-3%, which it's not because the CPI I'm skeptical of, but that's what they'll tell you. You'll feel good and they'll make you feel good about it. But when you look into the numbers haven't really changed. You still are paying as much as you were before for your cost of living.
That's why it's so important to look at your budget and just say, hey, like, where can I cut back? And, hopefully this stuff will roll over. Wages will increase. Inflation won't raise as fast as wages. But yeah, Drew, so why don't we wrap up the section? I thought this was pretty fun. Obviously it's a little doomsday-ish, but it was a good conversation. Hopefully the listener got some value out of it and can kind of get a better understanding of, where we are at in the economy, how and why we got to the place that we are. What are some of the outs that people can, look at going forward? Obviously the people aren't going to be, our listeners aren't going to be the ones pulling the levers, but, at least it's helpful to understand, hopefully, that what happens in the economy going forward, it might be a little more clear based on the path and the different levers the Fed has.
Sometimes for me to just being able to kind of vent our thoughts, I think can be helpful. Whether people think it's helpful or not, it helps me kind of to be able to kind of vent some of my thoughts out of my head and kind of vet them through. I also have to say when we were still in the beer business and we go to conferences, you kind of always felt like you were alone in your troubles with the business. And then you went and talked to people at conferences, other business owners, and they all had the same thing. And you kind of felt like you weren't the only one anymore. So I think maybe us just kind of venting our thoughts and people listening, they might even feel like they're not the only ones that are thinking the same. And we're just a big community and we're a neighborhood, man.
So if you guys do have any thoughts around the, inflation or the economy, let us know down in the comments if you're watching over on YouTube. And if you're not, head over to YouTube and drop a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Drew, I got a little bit of an itch. Not that type of itch.
As I'm itching my eye.
We were at grandma's marathon weekend last weekend, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Hannah, first of all, crushed it. Hannah, if you're listening, which I'm sure you're not, but you did awesome. She'd PR'd in the half, but
nice.
Being there and watching her do very well has me thinking I might have to start getting back into marathon running.
I don't
know why.
I was hoping that you weren't going to say that. When you end up saying I had the itch, you start talking marathon. I'm like, no way are you have the itch to run again.
I kind of have it. I've kind of got it. We'll see. I know I'm thinking that I'm for sure going to run a half marathon this fall. I ran Ely's last year. And I think that there's a one here in the Twin Cities, actually in Maple Grove in the park
Mhm.
reserve over there that I'm pretty sure I'm going to sign up for. So
Wow.
we'll
What made
see.
you get the
We'll
itch? I
see.
mean, obviously going and watching got the itch, but was it just seeing
Yeah, I
Hannah
don't
do a
know.
PR and beat your time or something?
Well, her PRs already always has been better than my time for sure. But I don't know what it is. I think just being around like that environment and like it was like the first time I was at a race and like felt sad I wasn't running.
Didn't you
So I was
say
like,
there
you know
was
what?
like a bloody bar or something that you went to?
Oh, yeah.
It's like
So,
that wasn't the
okay.
environment you wanted to
Yep.
be in.
So, okay. So the bloody, I'm going to take that one step at a time here. First of all, so Grandma's Marathon, you kind of end the half. The finish line is like you kind of loop around the deck, which is a hockey arena, and then you come into Canal Park. And the deck actually had a Bloody Mary bar watch party. So you could go
That's
get
it, the watch
bloodies.
party.
You could go and get bloodies, and you could watch the marathoners and like the tail end of the half marathons because it didn't open till 9. And I think the male runner came through at like it was probably like 9:45 ish or so. It doesn't really matter for the story, but yeah. So they had Bloody Marys, and let me tell you, Drew, they were pouring those things very strong. I'm pretty sure they were just volunteers that had no concept of bartending because they had like, just like one of those like I don't even like 12-ounce clear plastic cups, filled it with ice, but they put that thing like 75% of just vodka. And I'm looking at that, I'm like, I'm gonna be able to have like half of this, and I'm gonna have to go like maybe run a couple miles to burn this off. But no, that was awesome. That was like the place to be if you're or a spectator. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, that sounds really good. I know I was trying to talk with Jordan to see if maybe we wanted to go down for the weekend, but uh, what do we have going on? I think she was like, well, she was going back to work um, after her leave that she's been on for having the baby, and so she just did her first day of work on Monday, and she just kind of wanted to get the house together, get in like some good time with the kid, and then just kind of chill. So that's what we end up doing, is kind of hanging around the house. I feel like there was something else that we did around the area, but I don't know why I can't remember. But it was pretty much just hanging out at the house, and I think that ended up being pretty good. So we didn't end up making our way down to grandma's, and then uh, I think next week? Oh no, the week after that will be like the 4th of July, I want to say, and then we'll be heading up towards Crane Lake, and that's always very exciting time. We like doing that. We've been going up there the last couple of years, so really, if we're going on what's going on in my neighborhood, it's no Bloody Mary Mars. Bloody Mary Mars. It was no itching to go run in a marathon. Uh, it was sitting at home. Luckily, it was kind of cool this weekend. We still don't have our AC. I just ordered it.
Yeah.
So yeah, pretty boring on this side of it. I kind of wish I would have went down to Duluth and sat at the bloody bar, but I don't know if I could have done a 75% vodka tomato juice on the other side.
So like when I don't know. So I must have when they poured it in. I don't think they mixed it, and I like sipped the tops to like so I could carry them because I had like two on my hands. So I sipped the top of mine, and it was like pure. Well, one was for Hannah, one was for me, but it was like pure vodka, and I'm like, whew. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to get this thing down. Luckily, put some hot sauce in there, a little extra celery salt.
Mm-hmm.
It worked out all right. It worked out okay.
Oh, I guess. Speaking of concoctions, I don't know why putting celery salt in your Bloody Mary made me think of it, but I made some homemade gnocchis the other day, and those were quite tasty. I've made a couple in the past, but they weren't quite there. These last ones I made were pretty baller, not gonna lie. I felt like it could have been like an Italian restaurant, and I just got one of those. I don't know if they're like pastry or baking cutters. They're just kind of like a piece of metal. It's not sharp or anything, but it works really well with dough. And I just felt like quite the chef. And I had like the potato ricer to make it nice, and I just didn't do any measurements. I just went for it and just cut, and I was like rolling, and then I made the nice little grooves on the gnocchis, and then ate them. And I want to make them again. They were super, super good.
Just Gordon Ramsay in the kitchen.
Yeah, I was just screaming at my wife and kid, be my sous chefs. No, but I was able to like get those start to finish done in like a little bit less than an hour. So that was
Nice.
pretty good because you have to
Nice.
boil your potatoes, take the skins off, rice them, make them into ball, roll them. So I'm
So bringing up Gordon Ramsay reminds me, because he is known for like screaming at people, and there's this one video that will forever live in my mind rent free, and that he was, I forget if it was a competition or whatnot, and this woman like had to like boil water or add water to the boiling water, and he's like, what kind of water did you put in there? It's not boiling. And she's like, I put in cold water. He's like, why did you put in cold water? She's like, I thought it would boil faster. I was like, what? Are you dumb? Like, you got to heat up water to boil. Like,
what
I was going to kick out of that one.
I'll try ending it here. Just speaking of rent free in our heads, there's one video I have watched it hundreds of times, and I laugh every single time at it. And it's these kids in the cafeteria, and this girl's trying to being pushed by her other girlfriends so then she can get a pie into the face. And she comes around the corner, and they do the pie to the face, and just a little bit gets on her face, and the rest goes to this kid behind her that was just sitting down eating his
Just minding his own business.
eating his lunch, and then the camera pans over to him. He just has a whole pie face. He has like food in his hands. He just like staring like FML. And that one, I don't care how many times I watch it, I laugh every time, and that one lives rent free in my mind. But like I said, I'll wrap it up with that. So for anybody else listening to this podcast, if you already forgot what the podcast was about from that last segment, we were talking about inflation and kind of our thoughts around how we got here, and just was, like Cavan was saying in the beginning, just kind of shooting the shit. This is after our podcast, we do like to just kind of sit around and just kind of talk about what's going on in the current state of the economy that's not structured, and they can just be long episodes. So we wanted to try that for this episode. We hope you guys liked it. If you liked this type of style of a podcast, or you really thought some information was cool, or if you have a different thought of where this inflation is, let us know. Give us a subscribe, give us a comment, give us a like. And if you made it this far, we want to thank you for listening to this podcast, and we will see you next week in the neighborhood.